Hello and welcome to the Urban Design Panel here in Portland, Oregon. My name is David McElnay, and I am representing the Executive Committee of the Urban Design Panel today in introducing our panel presentation on the Burnside Bridge replacement. So the Urban Design Panel is sponsored jointly by the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, and the American Society of Landscape Architects, and is composed of professionals from these three organizations with a shared interest in urban design. We're joined today by Heather Wilson, Executive Vice President, CEO of the AIA Oregon. The AIA has been hosting this event ever since COVID in this Zoom format, which is going great, and we've increased our numbers in so doing. We're going to continue to do so. In addition to the monthly email announcement, our panel presentations can be found on the AIA Oregon event calendar, as well as their Thursdays at 3 newsletter. So if you participate in any of these urban design panels, that makes you a panel member. We encourage you to sign up for information about future presentations every third Tuesday of the month. And our executive committee works hard to fill that docket every month. When you register for any UDP presentations, you will be included in the upcoming invitations. We also encourage you to send any interesting future panel presentation ideas to Kathy Wendland at AIA Oregon. And Kathy's going to drop her email contact in the chat. We're recording this presentation as we do every presentation on a Vimeo file, which will be located and archived at AIA Oregon virtually, and the link will eventually show up in the chat box to take a look at this presentation, which will take a little while to get in there, but many of the others, at least going back several years, are located there as well. So this presentation is going to be approximately 30 to 40 minutes, maybe a little more, and be followed by Q&A session. So for the Q&A, please pose your questions and comments in the Zoom chat box. Also, feel free to raise your hand virtually, but in the interest of time, if you can drop it in the chat box today, that'd be great. Jeremy Shane is going to be looking those over and kind of making sure that we get a good cross section of the questions that are put out within the 1 hour that we have. Also, you can contact directly the presenters via email. I'm going to leave that up to their discretion by putting their email contacts in the chat box. I think they might have that on their presentation slides as well, but those who are directly the direct contacts, please do so. So today we have multiple representatives of the team that's going to be working on this Burnside Bridge replacement project, including Multnomah County, the selected bridge architects, which come to us from the United Kingdom today, and three or four, at least 2 or 3 others of the local representatives of the team, including landscape architects, planners. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pass that on. I think our first representative is the project manager from Multnomah County. So please tell us your position and take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Neal. I'm with Multnomah County. I'm the design phase project manager for Earthquake Ready Burnside Bridge project. I just want to say on behalf of the county and the project team, we're very excited to come back to this group and present about our project. I have to say some of our most favorite groups presenting to are architects and engineers, because they get it and they ask such great questions. So really looking forward to the Q&A at the end of this presentation. So I think we were back here during COVID, I think a few times in 2021. We do anticipate coming back to this group and providing additional project briefings about the project in general as the design advances. However, today we really just wanted to shine a spotlight on Beam Architects, who have recently come on board to the project and are supporting us. So today we just really want to focus on the meet and greet, but just know we're happy to come back to talk about other aspects of the project. So with that, I'll hand it over to Beam and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Just bear with me while I try and share the correct screen. Okay, hopefully you're now all seeing the screen. So first, an introduction to me. My name is James Marks. I'm the one on the left there. I'm a director at Beam Architects. In fact, I'm the M of the Beam acronym. And with me today is Keith Brownlee, who's the B of Beam Architects, and he'll be talking to you a little later in this presentation. So we've been appointed as specialty bridge architect for the Burnside Bridge project. But we're architects, but we work almost exclusively on bridge and large infrastructure projects. And between us, we have more than 50 years of experience in doing that. But before we move to talk about your site, I wanted to talk a little bit about what bridge architecture means to us, because it's a little bit different from building buildings. It's a very particular specialism. Bridges are architecture because they contribute to our urban realm in the same way that a civic building does. But bridges are spatial objects which you can experience by crossing them and interacting with them, and which can become destinations in our cities and landmarks on our skyline. But more so than buildings, bridges also have to conform to certain rules. And the principal one of those is the rule of gravity. They have to fulfill a purpose to cross an obstacle, in this case, the Willamette River, and to withstand the physical forces acting upon them. And for the Burnside project, those physical forces are seismic as well as mere gravity. Now, the architects in the audience will be familiar with the idea of firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, which was first introduced in classical times by the architect Vitruvius. In a modern context, those three words are often translated as strength, utility, and beauty. And it's debatable whether those criteria still hold true for building buildings today, but for bridges, they're very relevant. For bridges, strength and utility necessarily come first, and as bridge architects, it's our job to find beauty in that strength and utility. And to do that, we always work closely with our engineers at the early stages of a project. In researching this project, we came across this quotation about the Burnside Bridge, about how the original bridge was the first in Portland to employ the services of an architect to bring ornamentation to the engineering design. We're very, very well aware of the historic significance of the existing bridge, but our involvement in bridges is always far more fundamental than simply decorating a predefined engineering solution. As I'm going to show you, we also get involved in shaping the structure so that it is uniquely tailored to its context. The next few slides give some examples of what I mean by this. All of the bridges that I'm going to show you are taken from our portfolio back catalogue. So in all our projects, each bridge has a very specific form which is derived from its function and its context. Top left is the Gateshead Millennium Bridge in the UK. This is a footbridge which tilts open along its longitudinal axis. It's a beautiful piece of engineered structure. The architecture and the engineering are seamlessly integrated into a single dynamic object. You can't tell where the architecture starts and the engineering ends. Likewise, bottom right is a design we did for the Newark Bay Bridge in New Jersey. It has a very distinctive design with bifurcated piers, not because we thought it looked cool, but because there was an onerous Civil Aviation Authority surface limiting the height of the towers and the cables. And the Y-shaped towers were a way to keep the stay cables at efficient inclinations while staying beneath the clearance envelope. And it's the same for all our bridges. The flowing lines of these bridges are responses to spatial conditions on the bridge deck and also to the bending moments on the structural members. The structures are deep where they need to be to resist the loads imposed by gravity, but are also shallow where they can be for the economy of materials. The bridge architecture is driven by the bridge engineering, and it's not the other way around. For all our projects, as architects, we need to understand the flow of forces, as well as how the arrangement of cables, pylons, and arches can affect the spatial qualities of the composition and the experience for bridge users. We work with bridges at different scales across all typologies and modes. Increasingly, bridge owners are realizing the benefits of employing architects on very large infrastructure projects. The two bridges at the top of the page are the Long Beach International Gateway a large cable stay bridge in California, and the Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge, a multi-span arch in Washington, DC, both completed a year ago or two. Bottom right is the Mumbai Trans-Harbour Link, which actually opened last week. This is a 22-kilometre viaduct across the sea in India, where we were appointed to bring some design cohesion across proposals from 3 different construction consortia. So if we had to distill what we do into 3 processes, this would be it: constraints, context, and composition, in that order. I'd like to explain what I mean by these criteria as they relate to bridge design specifically. I'm going to describe these in reverse order, starting with composition. The composition or form of the bridge should be tailored to respond to the specific set of physical constraints and the unique urban context of the site. For us, composition encompasses materiality, spatial qualities, user experience, form, detail, and anything that affects how you perceive a bridge and interact with it. Unlike designing a building, bridge design is limited to a very narrow set of basic typologies. This is a slide from another project, but it demonstrates the 5 basic ways of bridging an obstacle, from shorter span simple beams and girders at the top of the page to longer span suspension bridges at the bottom. As you work down the page, not only do the spans get larger, but so does the cost. As bridge designers, establishing an appropriate structural typology is always our starting point. The spans of the Burnside Bridge are somewhere in the middle of this range. We will most likely be dealing with trusses, arches, and cable stay bridges. The spans are too short to make a suspension bridge worthwhile, and the longer eastern spans will make girders an inefficient choice. So first from the pattern book is the truss. This is the Broadway Bridge, which you all know, and this is probably the sort of structure that most people have in mind when they think of a truss. A lattice of braced members creating a ride-through structure. But trusses don't have to look like this. Here are some trusses from our own portfolio. You can see that the truss as a typology can be delicate, and it can be spatially beautiful. It doesn't have to be a clunky, heavy mass of members. Within the typology, there are very many opportunities for expression, from the cable truss, top left, to trusses with arch-like top chords, top right, to inhabitable space frame trusses as seen in this airport bridge, bottom left, to the inverted Fink truss, bottom right. And the same is true for arches. You all know the Fremont Bridge with its delicate braced arch profile, which dives below the deck to bounce back up to support the high-level highway. But we used a similar silhouette motif for the bridge we designed in Boston, Massachusetts, bottom left. Top right is the Waban crossing in Kingston, Ontario, which has the appearance of a deck arch with the arch member below the deck, but is actually a framed girder. And bottom right is a light rail bridge we designed across the Bow River in Calgary. This type of structure is called a tide arch, where the horizontal thrust of the arch is resisted by tension in the deck, meaning that you only transmit vertical loads onto the piers. The tide arch is likely to be a structural typology that would work well for the long east spans at the Burnside Bridge. And finally, to cable stay bridges. The Tillicum crossing, which you all know, is a fairly conventional cable stay bridge form with stay cables hung from vertical pylons supporting both edges of the bridge deck. But again, cable stay bridges can also offer extraordinary opportunity for expression. From the curved pylon of our bridge in Bahrain, top right, currently under construction, to the multiple masts of this bridge for the BBC in Salford, bottom right. The same structural diagram can also work with solid members in place of cables. So bottom left is a bridge we designed in Melbourne, Australia, which is a cable stay bridge in principle, albeit with solid stays instead of cables. Once we've established the basic form of the bridge, we then look at the detail. By detail, I don't just mean finishes such as railings and concrete surfaces, but more fundamentally, the shaping of the structure itself. We were commissioned to undertake the reference design for this bridge in New Jersey. It's a cable stay bridge supported from a pair of large pylons. Part of our role was to investigate how the light falls across the structure and shape the tower, not only to resist the forces acting on it, but also to break down its visual mass to give it this elegant appearance. And similarly, for the structure of the Frederick Douglass Bridge, the arch has a tapered form which evolves as it curves overhead. From a profile that is deep at its root, where we're resisting shear forces, to a wide cross-section at the apex, where we're resisting out-of-plane buckling, all with simple geometries that are easy to define and fabricate. But the composition of the bridge, the arrangement of the structural forms, all evolve from the individual constraints of the site. The Burnside Bridge has a very particular set of physical and geological constraints and a complex relationship with its urban context, which I'm going to hand over to Keith to describe to you next. Keith, are you there? Are you on mute? Okay. Well,
No,
Keith finds
sorry, it was an
okay.
unmute button. Yeah, just as you said it was complex, I couldn't find the unmute button. So this diagram, I mean, it's not massively accurate, but as James says, you know, it demonstrates a complex array of constraints. There are obstacles to span, there are no-build zones, there are clearances, there are maximum height moratoria, minimum height envelopes, there are connections to make their geometric and operational issues. I won't go into any of those, bar, next slide please. The most important constraint on this project. This project is fundamentally a life safety project. It's to be an earthquake-ready bridge, as you've heard. You know, it's a seismic problem to navigate. So you'll see some words there on the right which say the I-5 and railroad corridor, and beneath it a liquefaction zone, which means in an earthquake it's turning to liquid. All of that means you can't or really shouldn't put your feet down. So we have very limited opportunity for bringing structure to ground. If I could show you a pictogram, next slide. What that really means is this, is that on the east side of Burnside, when there's an earthquake, the ground turns to soup. And you need something long span to span over that. Conversely, you don't have that issue, at least to the same extent, on the west side, on the left. So you can put your feet down as often as you like. So hence the millipede can exist on the west, but you have to have a dachshund on the east. Next slide. So if you convert that into a diagram, and to be very clear, these are not designs, these are diagrammatic typological responses to that constraint. In other words, you can have short spans on the west, you need a medium span in the center, and you absolutely must have a long span on the east side. And with those short, medium, long, you get increasing dollars. Next slide. Unfortunately, the medium span is, well, it's two short spans, but they're very long when you're talking about opening bridges. So I'm afraid the dollars go up there as well. Next slide. So, you know, I've talked about physical constraints, but of course there's a whole host of architectural and urban design issues at play as well. So, you know, we're not preempting what might be the case, but you have real physical and cost constraints that drive you down a route on the east side, and on the west you can do what you like, notwithstanding the other physical and urban design constraints. But realistically, if you're going to add a $3 sign to each of those spans, that takes some justification. Next slide, please. So we've done this in reverse order, but in every case, what we do is about context. That's what makes architecture. Constraints make structure or make utility, but context makes beauty and makes appropriateness more to the point. Next slide. So, City of Bridges, Bridgetown. Might not surprise you that because we only design bridges, that every town we go to considers itself to be Bridgetown or the City of Bridges. But this is a significant river with a significant portfolio of bridges, historic and modern, crossing it. Next slide. But what it doesn't have is a prevalent typology. So you've seen this bridge before on the right-hand side, which is the Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge across the Anacostia in DC. When we started that project and we started to analyze what the bridges in that city are, that's them on the left. No mystery there. Every single bridge is a multi-span arch, and so is our bridge, which is at the bottom of that diagram. They're not to scale. Our bridge is much bigger than all of those, but I wouldn't say it designs itself, but one would be hard pressed to stick a cable-stayed bridge in that collection of arch bridges. If you go to the next slide, however, this is Portland's portfolio. It's a series of interesting bridges, but if you look at the next slide and you color code those typologically, there's a lot of colors, which means there's a lot of types. So the takeaway from that is we have a free hand, we believe, in typology terms, notwithstanding the fact that there are only 6 typologies, as James explained to you earlier. But we're not driven by one type or another. Next slide. So there is Portland. You might recognize it. The next slide shows you the significance, we believe, of Burnside. It's very interesting, Burnside. And it's terminated by the hills on the west side, but it's almost sort of curvature of the earth on the east side. But it's a real spine. It's the spine of Portland's book. And the next slide shows you when you emphasize the grids, you can see the way that the grid shifts on Burnside. It's the center. Next slide. And if you take a vertical through that, you understand that it's also the pivot of the grain of the city. You go from neighborhood to city center, downtown, and then you get the greater scale up there on the northeast. Next slide. And there is Burnside Bridge sitting at the hub of it. So I'll make a mention of scale. In any city, if you're building a big bridge, a bridge of scale, it's going to be visible. It's going to take on, and I use this word not lightly, but it takes on, or it has the potential to take on, a sort of iconic form just by its very visibility. And if you're going to do that, you kind of want it to be in the place that it should be. And so our contention is that it very much is in this city. That location is one that deserves or can handle its visibility in the public space. Next slide. So Portland, of course, it's very interesting to me because the west side is where the tall buildings are. The west side is where the commercial density is, and it looks like this might be in any other place what this bridge should do. Big on the west, low on the east. But that's not what happens on the Burnside corridor. Next slide. This is what happens on the Burnside corridor because there's a pair or a potential cluster of tall buildings on the Burnside corridor on the east, and of course the historic core on the west side is height limited, so it's completely opposite from other places in the city. So the constraints that I discussed with you are kind of backed up by the physical context of the place as well. Next slide. So last time I was in Portland, I went looking for this T-shirt because I knew it would exist, and it took me all of about 3 minutes to find one in Powell, City of Books. This is always the case. You know, here are the bridges all lined up very nicely with a central axis through the middle, saying symmetry, 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 all bar Hawthorne, which is a little bit of a left field aberration. That's not the reality, of course. Next slide. The reality is this. This is a very winding, meandering river, and the relationship between those bridges is not linear. They all exist in space relative to their own context. Some of them have context relative to other bridges, but there's no foreshortened longitudinal axis through the river that tells you that each of those bridges are part of the same stock. Next slide. So just to look at that aerially. So these yellow lines are taken through the center of the bridge, or the center of the opening span on all of those bridges. And it starts to kind of describe that relationship between the bridge as a centralized or a symmetric item and the land. In fact, you know, the views from the land become more important than the views from bridge to bridge. Next slide. So my observation was very much that the bridges operate very much as a sort of part of an urban tapestry. They appear in places from the land where you don't know. I mean, it's pretty obvious because they're bridge-type structures that they must be crossing an obstacle, which you know to be the river. But nevertheless, they exist amongst tall buildings. They exist amongst industrial context, and they exist amongst landscape. And they, as I said, they form part of an urban tapestry, which I think is a very interesting scenario that starts to question that idea of the bridge-to-bridge relationship as being more important than the bridge-to-building or bridge-to-urban context relationship. Next slide. So here is one of those more prevalent relationships between bridges. Those three bridges have an alignment on the river. Hawthorne, Morrison, and Burnside, which is slightly, I mean, it's not exactly parallel to the other two, but it you know, it has a kind of centralized relationship. If you apply those structural diagrams that I showed you of a cable-stayed bridge and an arch bridge on to the east side. Next slide. You see something quite interesting. I think particularly on the right hand there, where you get sloping off the page, the cables of a generic cable-stayed bridge. And again, I'll reiterate, these are not designs. You know, these are building blocks, if I can put it that way. But you see that in both of those cases, more so in the case of the cable-stayed bridge, that you get, you know, you retain a symmetry on the river because a bascule bridge has visual mass that overwhelms any lightweight structure that might be happening one or both sides of the bridge. Next slide. But this is interesting, at least it is to us bridge nerds. So because of the directional change in the river, the view south from Fremont through Broadway, through Steelbridge, doesn't look at Burnside Bridge at all. It doesn't look at the river at all. It looks towards the land. Next slide. So if you take a slightly elevated view down that same corridor with arch structure and cable-stayed structure generically, you see something else happens. You know, you can join up with that axis, but you're over land, which so happens to be that there's a requirement to have a long span over the land in that position. Next slide. Well, there are other axes as well, of course, because this is not only a river bridge, it's got a substantial requirement to span over the I-5 corridor and the railroad. So when you are on I-5, particularly traveling north, let's have a look at what that looks like with those same two diagrammatic parameters. I think this is very interesting because suddenly those structural types seem to have a meaning that's relevant to the highway, and a vast majority of travelers passing under this bridge will be in a vehicle, not on a boat or on any other river craft. And that, because I-5 takes a bend as well, it pretty much goes centrally, if you're heading north, underneath the apex of an arch, which is a kind of interesting consideration. Southwards, it's not quite the same, but you do get the same effect as those on ramps and off ramps to I-5 come down. I think we can see a view of those as well. Yeah. So you see these structures sort of take a meaning that's connected to the river, but it's not integral to it necessarily. Next slide. I think these are the last. We're coming up to the last slides here, but these view axes are informative and important. If you're on Burnside looking west, something interesting happens. You've got MLK5 on the left, on the bottom image. You've got MLK5 on the left, and you've got the yard on the right. But that gap, sitting bang in the middle of that gap, is the big pink off in the distance. So never mind the height of the grain of that part of town. Otherwise, you've got this really significant edifice filling that gap. Next slide. And we kind of wonder whether or not, again, this is not a design, this is just a diagram, but that you start to set up potential conversations between significant parts of the city. There's a conversation there between, in this case, the cable-stayed mast tower and the big pink. Next slide. And then looking the other way, this is also very interesting. My understanding when I was in Portland last, that there's this idea that as you're passing on the west side and you look down this corridor, because the yard is both tall and dark, there's a high potential for thinking that the Baskerville Bridge is open because it's bang on axis with Burnside. There's a little kink in the road that actually takes the bridge off axis from the yard and goes through that gap between the yard and MLK5. And that gap is really significant, because if you're putting structure there, you've got to pull that illusion away from the yard and into the gap. You've got to speak to that gap, we think. Next slide. Yeah, well, again, more diagrams, but you can see what's at play here is that we are playing with that gap and saying, okay, so do you frame that gap? Do you portalize that gap, or do you occupy that gap? Those are all things that come into play when you're thinking about what the structural type or the structural arrangement of the type might be. So next slide. By the power of PowerPoint, I think we've arrived at some Q&A. This is the last slide.
Thank you, Keith and James. Apologies if my screen's not on. I'm having trouble connectivity issues, but we've got an opportunity to carry on the dialogue. Can y'all hear me? I think, yeah.
Yep.
So please feel free to enter your questions or raise your hand. We can carry on this here. I think this is a nice introduction to it, and it appears that the context is really characterizing the opportunities as we understand along the way here. I don't know, David, if you have any observations to kick it off, but we can.
I do. Yeah, just to help sort of get people. I'm surprised nobody's written in any questions in the chat yet, but I did want to say thank you, Keith. The sort of 3 points, and one of the 3 legs of that being context, is obviously greatly appreciated by your audience today, being everyone sort of thinking about urban design. And it's great to see your team really actually that being an equal major driver to, other things like liquefaction and all these sort of reality-based things. So urban design is a reality that, the city here has been focused on for quite a long time, but there's still lots of good work to be done. So something as big as the Burnside Bridge being replaced, I wondered, thinking about bridge design, so the sectional qualities of the bridge and the experience of, we have a healthy multimodal, travel focus in the city, including bikes and feet and not just cars and trains. So is there anything in terms of the bridge design or sectional qualities that kind of inform that experience for the pedestrian connectivity, sort of the urban design experience at the ground level on foot, in between buildings, the third place, the place between destinations, physically on the bridge or approaching the bridge, separation from the water or separation from the sides of the river, for example, when you're down there to crossing the river. Some initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we have a saying in the office, and we also have a lecture that we can bore you with at some point, which goes along the lines of every bridge is a footbridge, but some of them allow vehicles on them. And the reason for that is, of course, because different modes experience any infrastructure at a different speed and a different pace, and they have different needs. So we talked about portalizing the highway through that gap, but that's something that would be of interest to all travelers. But there's a great difference between kind of going through that on the highway and the slow three-dimensionality, the kind of tactile nature of being a pedestrian. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know what the question is.
Right.
Yeah, we also have another saying in the office, which I thought Keith was going to say, which is we design.
Don't tell him that one.
We design journeys, not just bridges, and it is all about the user experience for the different modes. And obviously, it's going to be different for a pedestrian. And pedestrians are going to want to linger on the bridge and look out over the water and look at the views that the elevated deck might give them over the city. But it's also about the views and the experience underneath the bridge deck. So when we get to looking at the western spans, for example, we're very conscious that we're casting quite low over parkland, and anything that the structure can do to help to elevate this sensation of the bridge soffit so that it makes it airier and roomier and a nicer place to be underneath the bridge is also high up in our minds when we're working out what this structure could and should be.
Thank you for that. Let's continue on here. We have a few questions in here, and I know Megan introduced that we have 30 plus subs in the team, but I don't know, Steve Drahota, the project manager for HDR, might be able to answer what does the overall design team look like in terms of the major players on the design team?
Well, hello everybody. I'm Steve Drahota. I'm the HDR project manager for the project. I'll first say we're thrilled to have a firm like Beam supporting the project as our specialty bridge architect. It's amazing to have the kind of skill set and expertise and experience that they bring to this job, a very different perspective than a lot of the firms bring that are regional, local, and in combination with HDR as the design team, we're certainly looking to have an incredible result through this collaboration. I do want to say one thing going back before I answer your question about team. Bicycle pedestrian space and the pedestrian user experience starts with enough space. So I want to say that the city and the county especially have worked very hard to come up with a project that has and will have the largest bicycle pedestrian space across the Willamette River of any structure in the downtown core in 17 feet. And so that 17-foot space with the anticipated separation of bicycles and pedestrians with some sort of annotated descriptive buffer zone is helpful in doing that. So that's one where it kind of starts, and you can actually create the experience based on having some space to work with, and then contemplating the realm underneath. So with all that aside, I think that's where it starts, and then where it ends up, I'm going to be fascinated to watch. In terms of the team, which was really the question that was pitched to me, we do have a whole suite of engineers, architects, scientists of every make and model, a team of HDR, we're a prime consultant, we're a large full service firm, but we know that for this specialty bridge, we needed to bring on a complete team of about 30 different firms, of which Jeremy is going to be helping out with Mayor Reed. So we do have specialty firms for movable bridge, for the fixed bridge elements, regardless of the type that it takes, and we don't have any predetermined outcomes. This is going to be a public process that James and Keith and others in the bridge architecture world will take us through, ultimately fitting within the context of cost and context and constraints and all that. But we have a full service roadway team, a public involvement team, hydraulic team, pretty much every engineer you can think of under the sun, because this project touches so many different kinds of transportation infrastructure and frankly societal needs that we've gathered this really large team. And I think at our high point, we're going to have maybe up to 225 staff at any given moment working on this project, doing something. That might be our high point. So it's a large team. We're excited to be working on this project going forward, and we're excited to have had the opportunity to help the county through this endeavor. Long answer for a very short question. Sorry, Jeremy.
No, that's perfect. I mean, the dynamics of this project go all the way through the staging and the sort of preliminary. How do you route people around temporarily during construction, all the way to the finesse of how the bridge touches and implications that go out blocks as it lands along the way. So the bridge itself is very important, but there's many, many other aspects, as we all know. I think you two addressed this a little bit before, but just basically the bridge scale. On and under the bridge, how do you think the underside of the bridges generally add to some interest? Underside, how do they create interests in place? For example, like something for bridge passage, but the details of that, they vary depending on the experience. Was that clear?
Sorry, the question is, how do we go about creating interest underneath the bridge?
Essentially, yes, for the different uses, yeah. Okay,
well, you do get views underneath this bridge, particularly from the parkland on the west, and it's something that we've been starting to think about this week, because currently, if you look at the way that you might conventionally span the short spans to the west, the opening span, and then the long spans to the east, what the structure looks like from the underside might not necessarily be compatible. So we've been starting to think about ways of ordering the structure so that there is some sort of consistency in the soffit plan to how you deal with the different spans as you're going across and the different rhythms. So what's important to us is that when you're looking up at the bridge from underneath, the soffit of the bridge is as important to us as its elevation, because it's so highly visible from so many different aspects in and around the city there. So we will be looking at how you how you appreciate that bridge and how you understand the different structures and how it moves across, and giving it some sort of cohesiveness and consistency as you look through the short span bridges, for example, onto the opening span and across to the long span. And so we'd also think about how the piers, where the bridge touches the ground, it's a pretty significant part of the structure. So we'll be looking at the details and the shaping of those piers and how does the bridge get support from the ground. And it might be that we start looking at the shaping of the piers to start to minimize the span at deck level, for example. So for example, if we had a V pier in the park, you could put your feet down at ground level at long spacings, but by the time you get up to the higher level of the deck, the span is shorter and you can have a shallower span, for example. So there are lots of different techniques that we can look at as we go forward to kind of change the way that people on the ground will interact with this massive structure as it's passing overhead. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but hopefully it gives you a bit of insight into what we'll be looking at as we move forward with this project.
It sounds like also, James, this is David again, that in that context too, the scope of work for your team, potentially for HDR, is not the land, the parkway on the west side or east side for that matter, underneath the bridges, but rather how the bridges touch the land. I don't know if there's anything in the scope of work beyond that. Who can answer that one?
No, well, to be clear, we are the architect for the bridge, but that doesn't mean, our clients are always surprised that we spend the first half of our commissions looking at anything but the bridge, because you can't land something of this scale into the city without impacts, and it has to be driven by how it touches the ground and how people on the ground interact with it. So the first thing we do is look anywhere other than the bridge. So we're not, with apologies to our employers who are on the call, we're not employed to do it, and we're not designing that space, but we are facilitating it. It might be the best.
So that's reassuring for sure for everybody on this call. So maybe that's more of a question for Megan Neal with the county. If the county is indeed sort of the overall project manager and the scope of work for the land on either side of the river at the bridge.
Yeah, I think right now it's really not clear. I think we're still understanding the constraints of the space under the bridge right now. That space actually is not owned. Sorry, daycare's closed. That land is not owned by Multnomah County. We're there by easement. A lot of it's owned by the city of Portland. So it's really about working with the city to understand the impacts to that space, what they're looking for in terms of returning it to existing condition after the project, and what wiggle room is there in any improvements to the space after we leave at the end of the project. So I think it's still an ongoing conversation that needs to be worked out.
Right. So the bridge is a county facility, and I don't know that there's anyone sort of Portland Parks and Rec has to have some sort of hand in this in terms of the esplanades on either side and parks on either side. So I don't think that there's someone here on the call today about that, but that's a kind of a dot connecting opportunity on your side. And also for all of the folks that are here, we all converse amongst all of our, professional positions across a lot of different levels. So we're here also as a platform and to help facilitate, to get those points out on the open and then open those conversations. So John Spencer, further down the line on these questions, had pointed out, hey, John Spencer is executive committee emeritus, but he's here today asking, how can the urban design panel help? That is to say, from here, he's saying it's a great presentation, and how is this kind of comprehensive planning going to be transmitted to political types and ultimately to funding decision makers? So the urban design panel has in the past written white papers or letters of support or kind of shown up at critical meetings Megan, do you have any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that and offering that support. Right now we're about a third to half of the way there in terms of funding this project. What's really helpful is when groups submit letters of support or show up to important meetings for public testimony in front of elected officials or at the state legislature session. I know we'll be down in Salem in the 2025 ledge session advocating for this project for additional funding, since transportation will be a large focus of that session. So that would be an amazing time to connect with this group and get some additional support and voices out there supporting the project.
I see. So as you had pointed out, we've had you here twice. I think this is the third time. And then the next time sounds like that could be a critical meetup to raise everybody's awareness going into that 24-25. So thank you for that. So Jeremy, back to you.
Yeah, real quick, David, you mentioned the context and bridge landing. Mayor Reed is on the team as the urban design lead. So with this highly collaborative team, we'll be bringing the breadth of our perspective and our approach as urban designers, landscape architects, meeting with the architecture and engineering team to help facilitate those conversations. So there's questions about talking about bridges not as a collection or a subset, as a grouping of bridges. And this is by Richard Potestio. If the alignment doesn't matter as a group of bridges and it's isolated itself, does that change the context a little bit? If you're trying to think of the bridge as a unique and a discrete element, you mentioned it's visible and it will have a presence right in the middle of it. There's a big circle in the plan. Does that change, or does that influence the uniqueness of the bridge itself versus being part of an assembly?
No, I think by location, it differentiates itself from its neighbors, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to speak to its neighbors. So it's both things. It's part of a compendium, and it's also placing itself, well, it's being placed in a unique position. I mean, one thing we really do need to discuss is scale as well as form, because, I mean, for example, the Fremont Bridge, I do not think of as a urban city scale bridge. I think of that as a kind of edge of city, because it busts the city scale. So we need to be very circumspect about what we place in this context. And when I talk about context in terms of scale, it's not 2024 scale. It's this thing lasts for 120 years. So what is its role in defining urban growth as well as reacting to it? So Rick, I don't know the answer, but we're working into that notion, very mindful of the fact that it has to play both sides of the record. It's part of a series, and it's a unique part of the series.
I think talking about the rest of the series, I think what's interesting about the other bridges in Portland is that each one of them is very much of their time. They're built using the techniques and the technologies available at that time, and they're example pieces of engineering. And I think this new bridge at Burnside needs to be of its time now. We'll be using modern construction techniques, and I think that will be very apparent. And I think in terms of the suite of Portland's bridges, it'll sit well into that sequence of the bridges over time and over the centuries. So I think to some extent it doesn't matter whether it looks exactly like some of the other bridges. I don't think it should. I think it should be of this time now, so that it sits within that spectrum of structures that you already have.
Well, I think you guys led into the next. There's two questions that kind of talk about the existing context and maybe future-proofing it, and the whether or not you can plan for development or what that might play out on the east side. And I think you both. One of it was the views and the existing considerations and of today may change in the future. And then it talks about the scale on the basically if the scale changes with the continued Portland growth, does that change the approach? But I think you kind of teased into that a little bit on both of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other kind of thing that's paired with that on a large infrastructural is the next question. I think Jericho or someone asked, that was Burnside was turned into a couplet. So it's one part of a couplet now that it wasn't originally. And that is to say that everything's eastbound. So is that something that is like, I guess it's not all eastbound at this point. No, it's two-way. Are any of these large infrastructural discussions going on at this stage in the design, or city code heights on the west side, or transportation changes, couplets, etc.? Are those discussions set now, or are they still in motion? Anything like that? As far as input to your team, input to HDR and Beam, that would be ODOT, PBOT. So these infrastructural questions, are they set pieces?
Oh, I'll respond to that constraints question. So, and then try to hand it over possibly back to Beam. So from a context setting standpoint, when we did, and we're literally finishing up this month, the environmental analysis phase, we had to consider the historic, and I'll start on the west side, the historic downtown district, and that played a prominent role in establishing on the west side a low profile structure. We went through discussions with for Section 106, Section 4F, these federal requirements, working with National Park Service and FHWA, and the result of that was a mandate, not an option, but a mandate to keep the Burnside Bridge's deck surface effectively where it is and unencumbered by structure above. Should there be any impact viewing into the historic district or out of the historic district, it would have resulted in adverse effect because there's an option that doesn't do that. As such, most people think of the city code, the 75 feet on one side, 250 on the other, as the guiding constraints. Those are superseded by our NEPA, our environmental review process, that resulted in this finding that you have to avoid as a requirement impacts to view sheds in or out of the historic downtown. So that's what set the stage for that graphic. I thought was pretty masterful. First, the idea of a centipede and a dachshund to illustrate it, but this notion of cascading elevations as you move from the west to the east. The east side does not have those kind of constraints with it, and doesn't therefore drive a particular maximum height or scale. So there's more flexibility and more options, and that's what James and Keith can talk, or we're talking about, and can continue to talk about. So we did look at that, but that set the stage for how we're trying to respond to this bridge option. So with that, maybe I'll pass it over to Beam to see if they want to take the rest of the question.
No.
You've covered that. That's great. I guess I was checking to see, is there typically transportation authorities, when a change occurs, look to widen roads, for example, to put it in silly, blunt terms. Are there any, that was the other piece of the question that somebody brought up, was what the word is coming in from the roadways and traffic studies.
Well, maybe I can do that. That's an engineering question. I'll take that one too, and I won't force Beam to answer that one. So we did start off with, during the early stages of the NEPA phase, with a wider bridge, and through analysis, some of it driven by the realities of funding limitations and affordability, some of them driven by, frankly, need, we were able to demonstrate that we don't need to widen the bridge beyond what it is today. And in fact, we can extract a lane off of the bridge so that we can allocate more space for bikes and peds while maintaining that bus-only lane that goes in the eastward direction. So we will have a less, quote, lanes on the bridge and a more, urban sort of context, bicycle, pedestrian, active transportation space for others to use. And that's borne out through our traffic analyses. So We spent a lot of time reaching that conclusion, and that's where we stand. And so this is going to be one of those precedent-setting opportunities where when you replace a bridge, it doesn't have to be wider. I think that's sort of the trend that's happened over time. Well, this is a bridge that bucks that trend and says we can maintain the same overall width and just reallocate the space and still have an appropriate transportation function.
I think for this group, that's an important point to be made. So thank you so much. We've hit 1 o'clock, and there's great questions flowing in by one right after the other. But I'm afraid we've really run out of time. A lot of folks are going to have to move on, and everyone's got a busy day. So you all can refer to the items that are in the chat. Those of you who put those questions out, I encourage you to look for the email connects. I guess as the way the org chart goes, Megan is the point of contact as the client, and Steve, you're on the point of contact on the design team, and whomever else is in there who's willing to take questions directly. That'd be great. From the urban design panel side, let us know if there's some way to put a voice to any initiatives coming up here in 2024. But certainly it sounds like legislative sessions coming up in the longer run. That'd be great to have you back. We'll look forward to doing that. Keith and James, fantastic presentation, reassuring in a lot of ways from the last time we saw this team here at the Urban Design Panel. Thinking about context was a big deal and important to all of us. I'll say one last thing that was brought up earlier, which is this sort of daunting connect when you're going along the esplanades to get up onto the bridges to cross the river. Something really that all of us who use the river's edge a lot would really appreciate the team to think about in a form that makes sense. And with that, and I'm going to give it back to Megan or Steve for any final points before we sign off.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up in saying that we have a lot that we want to accomplish with this project in this year. We're hoping to land on a bridge type before the end of the year. So please be on the lookout for communications from our team about some outreach during this summer, which will kind of present various options that we're considering, and we're looking for the public to weigh in and provide feedback. And that'd be a great time for us to come back to this group and share those options and have a discussion. So that's just kind of putting in a plug for us to come back later this year.
This year, I think that'd be great. And I think maybe in my mind, we might make more space for Q&A. It's just really hard for us to get longer than an hour in any given time. You never know, seeing people drop off. There are 50 people on this call, so obviously there's a great appetite to know what's going on. Yeah, let me know, Megan. Contact us here at the Urban Design Panel, and we'll look out to the schedule of what makes sense next time. So again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you everybody in our professional cadre for showing up today. Very exciting and big and wonderful project. Really appreciate Beam's work here, Steve and Megan, on if you're feeling confident on your selection. Super exciting. And I bet you know that we would love to see them again as well if you can bring the whole team back, but you'll let us know the format you're looking for, Megan. With that, thanks everybody for being here at the Urban Design Panel. We will be back again next month with another exciting topic. Aaron Riom, can you help me remember what the topic is next month?
I think we're still confirming presenters for next month, but we're hoping that we may be featuring work happening in the Lloyd district, but
That's
TBD at this point.
Right. So we do have a schedule and a tentative schedule, and sometimes we have to confirm. We like to not let it be last minute, but we'll get it up on with the AIA website, etc., as soon as possible. So thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Stay warm, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridge team.